Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest, David Danelo, is the director of field research for the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at El Paso's National Security Studies Institute. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and served 7 years as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. He's also an author, and his latest book is called The Field Researcher's Handbook, a guide to the art and science of professional fieldwork, published by Georgetown University Press. When he wrote the book, David Danelo relied on his experience in the military as well as his subsequent work with the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol to inform his approach to fieldwork. The result is a very approachable book that, at its heart, advocates for getting outside to conduct research. That may sound obvious, but it's easier than ever, after all, to conduct some kinds of research without ever leaving the office. David outlines the protocol for conducting field research, but he also delves into the art and science of it too, which results in a title that helps explain the practice of field research for a broad range of readers. In this first episode of our 4-part series, David and I talk about how his desire to be paid to travel and write led to his work in field research, why it's important to take a step back from what you think you know about a subject before you conduct your research, and how his book actually came together. So David, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. So to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, particularly since it plays a big part in how this book came together. You were a captain in the Marine Corps and served in Fallujah, and tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
Well, 15 years ago, leaving the Marine Corps, I was on a mission to get paid to travel and write for the rest of my life. And I thought that people who did that were foreign correspondents. As it turned out, I later learned that getting paid to travel and write can quite easily be accomplished through myriads of other professions besides journalism and media work. And those types of activities, most broadly, tend to be categorized by organizations who commission them as field research.
Right.
And so I began engaging and embarking upon those pseudo-adventures, as it were. As I later learned, in the practice of field research, there is a professional aspect to it. It's probably more about being able to master the fundamentals, just as any craft is, and fundamentals that I'm still at work on and still developing knowledge on and still learning how to do in better and more effective ways as new technology emerges, as time goes by, and as I learn techniques from other colleagues, and as the world turns, as the old soap opera used to be titled back. Now I'm dating myself, but back
right. And I imagine every experience or every trip is a different experience too. So I suppose you continue to learn different tips and tricks along the way as well.
Well, it is, and so that's, I think, part of the subtext of the question I think that you're asking is that how does that also inform what I do now, and in the work that I do for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. A lot of our work is grounded in primary data collection and empirical research. So we talk to cops and crooks, which means that we talk to not only law enforcement to collect data and government officials to collect data, university researchers to collect data, but we also work with third parties, oftentimes to gain access to individuals who have been involved with extra legal activities, we would say.
Right.
So, which creates varying degrees of risk that we evaluate professionally, and that I'm part of a group with other colleagues that have assembled certain guidelines of how we go about doing our work that we preserve internally, of course, but
right.
That certainly were informed by some of the work that I did in the Field Researcher's Handbook. Previously, with the Foreign Policy Research Institute, we handled a field research program. So I've stepped away from that work specifically with them, but I did direct field research where we taught people who specifically were doing field research for think tanks how to go about their research both safely and effectively. So
Okay.
that was what we did.
Excellent. So I want to go back a little bit back to 2011, when you published a report called Toward a U.S.-Mexico Security Strategy, the Geopolitics of Northern Mexico and the Implications for U.S. Policy. And I think this might have been an early sort of precursor to your ongoing field research work, and it's itself is a fascinating look at the region and at the ways geology and geography impact politics. And it begins, I think, quite profoundly by stating to understand what is happening in Mexico, we must first step back from what we think we know about our southern neighbor. And I think that concept informs a lot of what you talk about in your book, basically looking inward at one's own knowledge as one examines an issue or begins research. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about why it was important to take that step back and why that was necessary for that project and any future projects that you worked on.
Well, I think one reason that we can see is kind of what's played out in the conversations over the past 2.5 years, almost 3 years, in the era of, and I guess we could say 3 years leading up to the election of President Trump, and then the conversations of what's occurred on the U.S.-Mexico border and of how we understand and interpret Mexico in the common discourse politically in the United States. Mm-hmm. I felt that it was pretty critical to take a step back if we're going to begin to discuss strategy and implications. I obviously would not have advised the president to proceed in the relationship with Mexico as he has chosen to do.
Right.
What's been interesting about his approach to Mexico strategically is while there's kind of an absence of really strategic thinking on the part of the United States, as I would characterize it, there's been more tactical pursuits where the president has tried to go after the trade agreement and then migration and things of that sort. Mm-hmm. Looking at it from Mexico's perspective, which stepping back has enabled me to do and had enabled me to do when I published that strategy, in collaboration, of course, with Foreign Policy Research Institute and a number of valuable partners inside that organization. Mexico is actually kind of getting the better end of this deal in terms of strategic views. And if you've seen how the Mexican government has dealt with President Trump, particularly López Obrador, AMLO as he's known, has really just kind of stepped back and let Trump just kind of stay hot air and taken the wins where it's been useful and essentially said, okay, well, what's happening up in the United States, that's their thing. So long as we have a trade relationship, and in fact, the Mexican government, many individuals of Mexico's voting public are very critical of Mexico's increased enforcement on its own southern border, mm-hmm. because they're saying, well, you're just doing that because the United States is telling you to do that. Going back to the value of field research, I got a pretty clear sense of how the Mexican political discussion unfolded based on geography in a way that I never did by traveling northern Mexico and really getting a sense of how all 6 northern Mexican states are almost kind of their own region. They each relate to the United States in their own way. You have kind of the Rio Grande Valley, you've got the desert, the Sonoran Desert and the Chihuahuan Desert, you've got Baja California, and each of those regions have a different relationship with the United States. And then northern Mexico itself has a different relationship with the United States than the South does. So I was able to kind of get a sense of that and, move that forward.
At the time, I mean, where were you in your own sort of professional pursuit of field research? I mean, was was putting that report together kind of the catalyst for you, or in terms of your subsequent career in that field, or had you been doing it already for some time?
So what I would say is I did, but I didn't know what I was doing. So I had transitioned into, in 2007, a little bit of a backstory, and I've never really discussed this publicly. and I don't think the individuals involved would have an issue with it. But I had actually had been part of a group of veterans. There was myself and one other veteran who had gone out and become a published writer. I'd written my first book. I was doing freelance journalism. I had regular work that I was doing for two different magazines. And so I was kind of making it as a writer, as I think both of you know, and the transition not just into civilian life, but into a completely freelance profession. It's challenging to become a freelance writer under any circumstances.
It is, yes.
It's certainly challenging in leaving the military under kind of not really any particular path. Well, in 2007, I had two choices set before me, and one was a program that had been designed that was offered selectively to veterans who were screened for it by the New York Times Company, and it had been designed by a well-known writer named Chris Chivers, who was very well known within the New York Times and has since published a tremendous book called The Gun, and follow-on even better book called The Fighters, which is one of the great stories of the Iraq and Afghanistan war era in terms of how it discusses veterans' identities and the veterans' journey. Well, Chris wanted to design a program for the New York Times Company that brought veterans in. So I don't know who the other candidate was, but I was one of the candidates. And at the same time, I was offered a chance to write my second book, which was The Border. And I ended up having to make that decision. And I had to say no to this whole career of freelance journalism, because if you're on a pipeline to become, it's kind of like Pinocchio becoming a real boy. Like if the New York Times Company is saying they want to groom you to get to a point to where you're a combat correspondent, and that was the purpose for the program. So myself and the other veteran were being specifically groomed, not just to be foreign correspondents, but to be combat correspondents based on our background. And so I was like, well, what am I doing now that I'm writing this book? So I wrote this book on the border. It's published. And I started getting work from think tanks that was commissioning me to do the type of research that ended up resulting in the 2011 book, the 2011 strategy that you referenced. Simultaneously, I was also doing what I described in the Field Researcher's Handbook as government field research. So I had been commissioned by the State Department's Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program for short-term trips to do assessments with a small team of experts, because I was now seen as a subject matter expert on the U.S.-Mexico border and on borders in general, and on analyzing borders. And most subject matter experts from borders either came from the customs background or the border patrol background, which are very distinctive border management institutions. The border patrol, in any border patrol in the world, manages between a port of entry, so they keep stuff out, and they're basically, they have a guarding function, whereas customs has a processing function for managing a checkpoint. Well, I didn't come from either background. So I was trying to figure out, to answer your question directly, okay, so where did I go in 2011? Well, I didn't really know what I was doing. As it turned out, I was doing field research. And so that became then, following my work in the government, following my work in policy, I wanted to be able to explain, okay, what am I doing? What am I actually doing? What is this career? And field research seemed to be the best way to define it.
Okay. And then you had, in the year subsequent, I forget which organization you were with at the time, but you actually put together guidelines or some sort of framework in how to perform field research, correct? Prior to the book being written.
Well, initially, so prior to the book being written, I did put together a framework for the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
Yeah,
so that became
correct.
the genesis for our field research program, and then that was a platform that then we used to create the book. So the book came together. I mean, the book was inspired essentially by the idea that there is sort of a methodology to what it is that we're doing. And a lot of the work that was out there on field research, and still is very theoretical. And I'm not an academic. As you know, if you glanced at the book, and I think I was really privileged to work with Georgetown University Press on it. Never really thought I'd be published under an academic label, because I definitely don't really have substantial academic credentials per se in the field research arena. I've never really studied the theory of it beyond what I've read, but I've done it. And so in the doing of it, I think the publisher, the editor, and I all felt that there was some value in really trying to just kind of tease out, okay, what does this look like? And not just, what does it look like for different types of individuals, whether they're involved in, academic work, involved in government work for any government in the world, involved in even, we discuss professional field research. I had a chance during my travels and continue to meet individuals from specific industries who are responsible for whether it's energy or some type of manufacturing or extraction or, any type of trade. There's people doing field research work in their respective industries across the gamut of industries, and understanding and illuminating that was I think of value for readers too.
Excellent. Yeah, I think consequently, frankly, when I started reading the book, because it was published by Georgetown University Press, I just made the assumption that there was a bit of an academic spin to the title itself. But in fact, the audience I think that the book is for, it can be quite broad. And because you're coming at it from such a practical, useful perspective, as you just mentioned, there's all kinds of sort of potential readers for this book.
There are indeed.
You just heard from David Danelo, author of a new book published by Georgetown University Press called The Field Researcher's Handbook, a guide to the art and science of professional fieldwork. David is the director of field research for the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at El Paso's National Security Studies Institute. Join us next week when David and I continue our conversation and talk about the more creative elements of field research and how bias and positionality can have an impact on what you take away from fieldwork.
I was with a friend who had also spent time overseas and was working as my photographer. His time overseas had been entirely as a civilian. So he's got a nice untucked shirt, he's casual, he's relaxed, and I had a tucked in one of those old Under Armour shirts, the green ones that stuck to your skin, and I was in shape, and I had wraparound sunglasses, and we were walking towards a migrant shelter in El Paso, and there was a line of individuals that were lining up to meet with immigration attorneys. And when they saw me, they visibly jumped, like they were visibly startled, like you could see there was a ripple reaction to me. And my buddy looked at me and he was like, "We got to get you a new look."
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino. And all of our episodes are produced by Choice's digital media specialist, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.